Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today, we're here to discuss another very important topic. Our topic of discussion for today is episode 18, Venezuela's economic crisis, a failure of socialism or the result of US sanctions, with Abdulla Baqer. Abdullah Baqer is a rising junior at the American Baccalaureate School in Kuwait City, Kuwait. I met him at a summer program, and he's a very dedicated and hardworking student who is interested in the field of economics and politics, and he's a great guy to work with. So, Abdullah, is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction that I've just said?
Well, I always do like to take things for opportunities, and whenever I get access to such, exclusive information, I wouldn't deny it.
Thank you, Abdullah, for the introduction. So let's get into a topic of discussion for today: Venezuela's economic crisis. So a little bit about Venezuela. In the early 20th century, in actually 1908, during President Juan Vicente Gomez, when he assumed power in Venezuela after a period of instability, his tenure was marked by stability, and it was the beginning of Venezuela's oil boom. And in the 1920s, the discovery of oil in Venezuela transformed the country's economy. By the end of the 1920s, Venezuela became one of the world's largest leading oil exporters, and this newfound wealth led to significant economic growth and modernization. And in 1935, after the death of Gomez, his successor, Eleazar Lopez Contreras, implemented a series of reforms aimed at modernizing the country. This period sees the beginning of more democratic political system. And between 1948 and between 1945 and 1948, a military coup happened in Venezuela, which brought the government of Romulo Betancourt to power. Betancourt's government is known for its democratic reforms, though it is short-lived, ending in 1948 with another coup. And in 1958, the end of the Perez Jimenez dictatorship ushered in a period of democratic stability. The Pact of Punto Fijo was signed, creating a framework for democratic governance and power sharing among major political parties. And in the 1960s and 1970s, Venezuela experienced economic prosperity due to high oil prices. The government invested heavily in infrastructure amid social programs. And in the 1980s, economic downturns and corruption issues began to affect the stability of Venezuela. Economic mismanagement and falling oil prices led to public discontent. And in 1989, the Caracaso riot occurred in Venezuela, which was a large-scale uprising triggered by economic austerity measures and the sharp increase in gasoline prices. And then we are brought into the late 20th century. In 1998, Hugo Chavez is elected president, campaigning on a platform of anti-corruption and populism. His presidency marks the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, which includes widespread social reforms and a significant restructuring of the political and economic systems. And in 2002, Chavez faced a brief coup attempt, which he successfully overcame, and his administration continue to face internal and external challenges, including opposition from the business sector and the United States. And in 2004, Chavez wins a recall referendum, solidifying his position. His government continues to implement socialist policies, including nationalization of key industries and expansions of social programs. And then we're brought into the presidency of Nicolás Maduro. After Hugo Chavez died in 2013 and Nicolás Maduro, his vice president, assumed the presidency, Maduro's tenure is unfortunately marked by increasing political polarization, economic crisis, and social unrest. And in 2014, protests erupted against Maduro's government, driven by high inflation, shortages of basic goods, and allegations of electoral fraud. And in 2017, the government called for a constitutional assembly to rewrite the constitution, which opponents argue is a move to consolidate power. And the assembly, which is the Venezuelan parliament, is established during this time in 2017, despite widespread protests and international condemnation. And then we're brought post 2018. We're brought into post 2018. Nicolas Maduro is again elected in a controversial election that is widely criticized by international observers as fraudulent. The opposition, led by Juan Guaido, declares Maduro's presidency illegitimate, and calls for his resignation. And Guaido declares himself interim president, receiving recognition from several countries, including the United States. However, Maduro retains control of the military and key state institutions, And in the 2020s, Venezuela faces a severe humanitarian crisis with hyperinflation, widespread shortages of food and medicine, and massive immigration of Venezuelans seeking better living conditions abroad. The government and opposition remains deeply entrenched in their positions, with ongoing international efforts to resolve the crisis. And now we're brought into a current political situation which remains volatile, with frequent clashes between government forces and the opposition groups. And the country continues to grapple with severe economic difficulties and a humanitarian crisis, leading to widespread suffering and displacement of its position. So this is a very brief summary of Venezuela's political situation in the 21st century and in the late 20th century. So are there any more information or any opinions that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Shazib Karim, Abdullah Baqer, or Arif Malik?
Yeah, sure, Araf. If you don't mind, I'll add my own opinion. And I'd say that just to talk about Venezuela. So Venezuela was the wealthiest country in Latin America, has become synonymous with economic collapse, hyperinflation, and mass migration. But we have to ask ourselves how it came to this. And to answer that question, I'd say we need to explore the narrative of the social. Start with the first narrative of when Hugo Chavez 1999, and he promised to transform Venezuela to a new socialist vision. And the government took control of key industries, including oil, which accounts for a staggering 98% of Venezuela's export earnings. And Chavez's policies aim to reduce poverty and inequality by redistributing wealth, investing in social programs. And at first, it seemed to work. Poverty rates dropped and social spending increased. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, and the reliance on oil revenue made Venezuela vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. And when prices were high, the economy boomed. But when they fell, as they did in 2014, the economy plunged into crisis. And critics may argue that this reliance on oil revenue, combined with the mismanagement and corruption within the government, led to the current economic collapse. And the nationalization of industries is seen as a key factor in the decline of productivity, and the government's heavy-handed approach to the economy created a hostile environment for both local and foreign businesses. And the second narrative that we need to look at is the impact of U.S. sanctions. As we know that there's another side to the story. Venezuela's economic troubles didn't start with Chavez or his successor, Nicolás Maduro. Many point to the impact of U.S. sanctions as a major contributor to the crisis. And the United States has imposed sanctions on Venezuela since 2006, but they intensified significantly in 2014, targeting individuals, businesses, and crucially, the oil industry. And the argument here is that these sanctions have crippled Venezuela's ability to export oil, access international financial markets, and import essential goods, including food and medicine. And according to this view, the sanctions have exacerbated an already struggling economy, turning a difficult situation into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. So I would also like to comment on how interesting the topic was, that Venezuela was once one of the most influential countries and had a very stable and strong growing economy, and how the economy suddenly just fell and crumbled, taking down its interesting gold mines and oil tycoons.
Yeah, I would agree with Abdullah and Shazib over here, but I would also say, like, on top of that, one of the main reasons why Venezuela collapsed was because mainly because there's a financial saying that never put all your eggs in one basket. But what Venezuela did was put all of its eggs in one basket, and ultimately, when the basket was torn, all the eggs dropped, and Venezuela, as a result, subsequently suffered. Because the main reason why Venezuela suffered is, of course, politically there was a lot of sanctions, but I would say there's also one of the major reasons was that, like, statistically speaking, like 96% of the exports of Venezuela and around 50% of the government revenue came from oil. And the sharp drop in global oil prices from over $100 per barrel in 2014 to under $30 per barrel in 2016 devastated the economy. So I think Venezuela is the only non-Middle Eastern, no, I would say only Latin American country that is part of the OPEC cartel. And I don't mean cartel in a negative way, but in an economic way. Like in macroeconomics, when we say cartel, is like basically the agreement between the competing firms who work together to increase the profits. So Venezuela is part of the OPEC cartel, but one of the main reasons why Venezuela economically suffered is because it didn't diversify its economy. Like if you look at the Middle East, like let's take UAE for example, like the United Arab Emirates is also one of the countries of the OPEC, and also like let's say Saudi Arabia, and like many of these countries are also dependent on oil, but they diversify the economy. Like in Saudi, for example, they're diversifying the economy to the sports sector. Like players like Cristiano Ronaldo and Neymar are playing in Saudi Arabia now, which shows that the government is more than willing to invest in other sectors more than oil. So in the case that oil sector isn't doing that good, the other sectors can back up the economy. So I would say that's one of the main reasons why Venezuela suffered a lot. And yeah, that's basically for my end.
So I also agree with Arab regarding that the Middle East and other countries were actually focusing on diversing their income and GDP to other things other than just oil. Even though the country was rich in oil and depend on it, they decided to diversify over more than one thing, including tourism and economic stability and other things like trade. While Venezuela, as a country, decided to just focus on one category, which led to its downfall eventually. Yeah, I definitely agree with that too. Our review actually really brought up a really interesting point of how Middle East is really focusing on diversifying it. Like the fact that they're like investing so much on these footballers, as you said, Ronaldo, Neymar, and many others, it really shows about how much like they're really putting big effort into diversifying and going to other sectors other than just oil, which Venezuela didn't, as they only focused on oil. But yeah, you brought up a really interesting point of how Middle Eastern countries are really focusing on diversifying it.
Thank you for sharing all the opinions about Venezuela's economy and political situation in the 20th century. I think it's also important to understand a brief history of the US sanctions that have been placed on Venezuela, because our topic of discussion again is episode 18, Venezuela's economic crisis, a failure of socialism or the result of US sanctions. So talking about a little bit about US sanctions on Venezuela, in the 1990s, US and Venezuelan relationships actually were very good, but issues arose over trade and energy policies. In 2001, the US imposed sanctions on individual Venezuelan officials accused of corruption or human rights abuses. These are relatively minor compared to later measures. And for some perspective, these sanctions were placed on Venezuelan officials, government officials. They were not placed on the nation on Venezuela. They were not placed on Venezuelans. They were just placed on some Venezuelan government officials. This is very similar to in Bangladesh. Some Bangladeshi government officials are under US sanctions. It is very similar to how Venezuela was in 2001. And in 2002, after a short-lived coup against Hugo Chavez, the US imposed a visa ban on Venezuelan officials involved in the coup, and the sanctions are lifted when Chavez is restored to power. And obviously, this shows that Chavez and the US had a very mutual relationship, because the US supported Chavez during the coup, and between 2006 and 2007, tensions increased as Chavez's government pursued anti-American rhetoric and strengthened ties with countries opposed to US policies such as Iran and Russia. And in March 2014, the US imposed sanctions in response to a violent crackdown on anti-government protests in Venezuela. And this sanction again targeted individuals involved in human rights abuses and corruption. And in March 2015, President Obama signed Executive Order 13692, declaring Venezuela a national security threat, and the order sanctioned Venezuelan officials responsible for human rights violation, corruption, and undermining democratic processes. And these sanctions included asset freezes and travel bans. And in August 2017, the US imposed sanctions targeted Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA and restricted US financial transactions with the Venezuelan government. These sanctions are a part of a broader effort to pressure the Maduro government over its handling of the economic crisis and alleged election irregularities. And then in 2018, sanctions are again intensified following a controversial president election in which Nicolás Maduro is re-elected and amid allegations of fraud. And in January 2019, after Juan Guaido declares himself interim president, the U.S. recognizes him and increases sanctions against Maduro's government. And sanction target Venezuela's central bank, state-owned enterprises, and key sectors of the economy, including oil and gold. And these measures aim to isolate Maduro regime financially and economically. And in 2020, the US continues to tighten sanctions, including measures aimed at blocking transactions with the Venezuelan oil sector and further targeting individuals and entities associated with the Maduro government. And the humanitarian situation in Venezuela worsens with increasing international concern about the impact of sanctions on ordinary Venezuelans. And in 2021, the Biden administration maintained the sanctions, but it signals a willingness to engage diplomatically to address the Venezuelan crisis. The sanctions remain focused on key sectors like oil and gold and on officials involved in human rights abuses and corruption. And in 2022, the US continues to enforce sanctions while participating in international discussions and aiming to resolve the political crisis in Venezuela. And this ongoing debate over the effectiveness and impact of sanctions on both the government and the general population. And in 2023, the US maintained a stringent sanction regime while exploring potential avenues for dialogue and negotiations between the Venezuelan government and opposition. The situation remains fluid, with periodic adjustments to sanctions based on political developments and humanitarian concerns. And obviously, there are severe impacts and controversies regarding the US sanctions, and one of them is economic impacts. US sanctions have significantly affected Venezuela's economy, particularly its oil industry, which is crucial to the country's revenue. The sanctions have contributed to hyperinflation, severe shortage of food, and a deepening humanitarian crisis. And there are also humanitarian concerns with the sanctions. Critics argue that sanctions disproportionately impact ordinary Venezuelans rather than the government, exacerbating the country's humanitarian crisis. And the debate also continues over the imbalance between pressure on the regime and the humanitarian impact on the population. And there are also political implications of the sanctions. Sanctions have been a key tool in the US foreign policies towards Venezuela, reflecting broader geopolitical tensions and the international community's response to the crisis. The effectiveness and consequences of this measure remain subjects of ongoing analysis and debate. So this is a very brief history of the US sanctions on Venezuela. Are there anything that Arif Malik, Abdullah, Baqer, or Shazib Koim that you would like to add to the things that I've just said?
Yeah, I would like to add a small thing. So I do understand that the USA wanted to tighten sanctions on them for a political reason of corruption. But the way they did it won't only affect the political leaders who were corrupt, but the citizens themselves and the people in a bad way, which crumbled their economy and GDP, making more suffering and leading to people losing their jobs and lower incomes, which therefore led to a bigger crisis than the ones that were originally that they originally wanted to stop. So, in my opinion, the USA should have acted differently in this current situation. Yeah, and to add some more information, Araf, you already touched on the origin of it and the background of it, and I can talk more on the geopolitical perspective. So I'd say that from a geopolitical perspective, Venezuela represents a strategic background, as the US has long viewed Venezuela as a challenge to its influence in Latin America, particularly under the leadership of Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, who aligned themselves with anti-US government and movements worldwide. And the US government has justified the sanctions as a necessary measure to pressure the Maduro regime to restore democracy and human rights. However, many analysts argue that the sanctions have not achieved these goals. Instead, they have deepened the political and economic crisis in Venezuela, entrenching the government's hold on power by providing it with a convenient scapegoat for the country's woes. Furthermore, the sanctions have driven Venezuela closer to the U.S. Adversaries, such as Russia, China, and Iran, who have provided support to the Maduro government in various forms, including financial aid, military cooperation, and diplomatic backing.
Yeah, I would agree with Shazib and Abdullah that the main reason why Venezuela there was economic challenges was that because of so much corruption in the government, and also because of the U.S. sanctions. I would say the U.S. sanctions crippled the Venezuelan economy because when the U.S. put sanctions, the U.S. and its allies also put sanctions, and the majority of the US allies and the US itself are like the top economies in the world. So if the top economies in the world put sanction in your countries, you're pretty much screwed. So that's what happened to Venezuela. And other than that, I would also say like recently as well, like just before this podcast, I was searching up on Venezuela, and like recently they held their elections as well, in which Maduro won, I believe, again, and he was for the third consecutive time he won the presidential election. And this time, like, all the neutral independent observers, including the National Electoral Council, like, called the election as fraudulent, which means that basically Maduro, who's the Venezuelan leader and president, like, stole all the votes and declared himself as president. So that's what the problem is with Venezuela, is that the leaders are corrupt. And even if the leaders are corrupt, if the leaders actually corrupt, the leaders, like, even if they come to power in like ways that are not really ethical, if the leaders are smart enough with how to run a country, then the people don't mind it as well. But if in case of Venezuela, like Nicolás Maduro, like, the problem with him is that he's taking the resources from his country and siphoning it off to other countries, which is why Venezuela is not developing and other countries are developing as a result. And also, like, one other reason why I would say, like, the socialist policy that was initially implemented by Hugo Chavez was again continued by Maduro. And I'm not saying that socialism is bad. Like, like socialism in many countries, including like Scandinavian countries, are actually good because they provide like free healthcare, free education. But the problem with Venezuela is that many of these socialist policies were strictly tied to the oil revenue. So when the oil revenue fell in 2016 and in subsequent years, the backbone of the Venezuelan economy also fell, and therefore these socialist policies could not be used anymore as a result. And therefore, due to the economy declining so much, the government reduced the interest rate. But this actually worked in the opposite way, like Turkey, and this caused hyperinflation. And like by 2018, inflation had reached, I believe, like like 1.7 million%, which was the top in the world. So it shows that Venezuelan government, the currency, which is the Venezuelan bolivar, it basically like became nothing. So let's say if you own like 100,000 bolivar equivalent, like that equivalent, the purchasing power of that bolivar, of that 100,000 bolivar, would be like pretty much nothing now because of the hyperinflation. So therefore, I would say another main reason why Venezuela suffered is because of the corruption and the fact that many of its socialist policies were tied to the oil revenue sector, and that was a problem, I would say.
Thank you for all the opinions that have been shared. Now let's talk about a little bit about oil in Venezuela and how oil came to be so much important in Venezuela's economy, because the history of oil in Venezuela is actually very, very old. It has been almost 100 years since oil was it has been more than 100 years since oil has been discovered in Venezuela. So in 1914, the first significant discovery of oil in Venezuela is made in the Lake Maracaibo, and in Spanish it's known as Lago Maracaibo region. And this region is crucial as Venezuela transitions from a largely agricultural based economy to one increasingly influenced by oil. And in the 1920s, the discovery of oil leads to rapid industrialization and economic growth in Venezuela. The government starts to leverage oil revenue to modernize infrastructure and public services. And in 1930s and 1940s, the oil industry expands with major investments from international oil companies. The industry becomes a cornerstone of Venezuela's economy, and oil revenue begin to significantly impact the country's financial stability. And during Juan Vicente Gomez's era, which was between 1908 and 1935, he was pivotal in the early development of Venezuela's oil industry. He consolidated total control over the oil sector, establishing policies that favor foreign investment and laying groundwork for future economic growth. And while Gomez's regime does not significantly use oil wealth for broader social programs, the economic stability achieved under his leadership helped stage the world for future Venezuela for future investments in infrastructure. And then came Romilo Betancourt between 1945 and 1948, and between 1959 and 1964. During his first term following the coup of 1945, he began to use oil revenues to promote and social and economic development. Reforms included investments in education and healthcare. And between 1959 and 1964, during his second term after returning to power, his administration continued to prioritize social reforms. His government also implemented policies to reduce poverty and improve public services, leveraging oil revenues to fund these initiatives. And during the Raul Leone era of 1964 and 1969, Raul Neri continues to the development of social programs initiated by his predecessors. His administration invests in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, and the oil boom of the 1970s further strengthens his ability to fund these programs. And then came the president's rule of Carlos Andres Perez between 1974 and 1979, and then again between 1989 to 1993. During his first term, he saw a dramatic increase in oil revenues due to the 1973 oil prices, which increased the oil price around the world. And the government uses these revenues to finance extensive social programs, including housing projects and public works. And during his second term in 1989 to 1993, Perez's second term is marked by economic difficulties and social unrest, including the Caracaso riots in 1989. The economic policies and austerity measures implemented during this period faced significant backlash. And then came Hugo Chavez between 1999 and 2013. He was elected in 1998, and he used the substantial oil revenues from high global oil prices to fund social programs and support his populist policies. And his government also invested heavily in healthcare, education, and poverty reduction through missions such as Barrio Adentro and Mission Robinson. And he also faced a lot of economic challenges. Despite the initial economic success, Chavez's policies led to economic imbalances and a reliance on oil revenues. The government's extensive nationalization and centralized economic control created long-term issues for economic stability. And then came Maduro's rule in 2013, and until the present day. His Maduro, who's the successor of Nicolás, who Chavez, inherited a struggling economy heavily dependent on oil. His administration faced severe economic challenges, including oil revenues, mismanagement, and international sanctions. And he also had a lot of humanitarian crisis. The continued reliance on oil and poor oil revenue, global oil revenue, global falling oil prices, combined with the falling oil revenue for Venezuela, combined with the corruption, exacerbated the humanitarian crisis with hyperinflation, shortages of basic goods, and widespread poverty. So this is a very brief introduction of different presidents who ruled Venezuela, and how they used oil to how they use oil to influence the Venezuelan economy. So are there any opinions or any information that you would like to add, Shazib Karim, Abdullah Baqer, or Arif Malik? Shazib, you have your hand raised. Would you like to say anything?
Yeah, sure, Araf. So, to talk about how they utilized oil and the oil industry in general, I'd say that that Chavez saw oil as the key to reducing poverty and inequality in Venezuela, and his government implemented what came to be known as petro-socialism, where all revenues were channeled into social programs, subsidies, and infrastructure projects. And under Chavez, PDFSA was transformed from a relatively independent and professional oil company into a tool for the government's social and political objectives. And the company's revenues were used to fund programs like free healthcare, education, and subsidized food, which were popular with the poor and helped Chavez consolidate power as well. And however, this strategy came at a cost, and the focus on short-term social spending led to underinvestment in PDF, essays, infrastructure, and operations. Maintenance, exploration, and development of new oil fields were neglected, leading to a decline in production capacity. Moreover, Chavez's decision to replace experienced managers and engineers with loyalists further weakened the company's efficiency and expertise. And we can also look at the decline of the oil industry. And as by the time Nicolás Maduro succeeded Chavez in 2013, Venezuela's oil industry was already showing signs of distress. And the global oil price crash of 2014 exposed the fragility of the Venezuelan economy, which was heavily dependent on oil exports for revenue. And with oil prices plummeting, Venezuela's income shrank dramatically, and the government struggled to maintain its social programs and subsidies. And the situation was exacerbated by continued mismanagement and corruption within PDFSA. And production levels fell sharply from over 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to less than 1 million barrels per day by the late 2010s. And the decline in production was not just due to low prices. It was also due to the mismanagement as well.
So I actually agree with Shahzeeb, but regarding the oil, Venezuela's economy could have actually used the oil to their advantage, and they should have actually paid more attention to their oil resources. For a small example regarding oil, it would be the Middle East. So most of Middle East currency is actually built on or related to oil and gold. And since Venezuela is actually one of the countries that has a lot of resources regarding gold mining and oil, if they actually would link their economy more to this specific area instead of just economy and trade, it would have stayed more stable. So, as we said earlier, they focused on one thing, which is trade and economy, so it collapsed. While other countries like the Middle East and other countries that invested in oil and gold are known to have higher currencies. So, an example would be Kuwait, and Kuwait's currency is, let's just say, stable on oil and gold. And since oil and gold is relatively, it keeps itself in value. So to this day, Kuwait has the highest currency in the world regarding this specific topic. And that's it.
Yeah, I would agree with Abdullah and Shazid that the Kuwaiti dinar is the most valuable and the strongest currency in the world. And like many Middle Eastern countries, like Jordan, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, like they actually peg their currency to the US dollar. So the main reason for that is the US is probably the largest exporter of oil from the OPEC countries. So given this fact, the US exports majority of the oil, and like US and its allies export majority of the oil. The fact that this Middle Eastern and OPEC countries actually peg their currency to the dollar makes it more stable. So if the US is in an expansionary period, then these countries will also experience an expansionary period. And likewise, when the US is in a recessionary period, these countries will also experience a recessionary period. So, and given the fact that the US dollar is probably the US dollar is not the strongest currency in the world, but it is the most valuable currency in the sense that many people assume it to be the safest, which is why many people try to hold on to the US dollar because they know it's a stable currency, and this is why majority of the foreign reserve in many countries abroad are actually hold their currency in dollars. So this shows that US dollar is probably valuable, and this is why many Middle Eastern countries peg their currency to the dollar. But with Venezuela, they actually didn't peg their currency to any specific currency like the dollar, and because of this. And the fact that Venezuela had a very difficult relationship with the United States, which is not that far from Venezuela, it sort of destroyed the value of the currency. And other than that, I would also like to talk about something that we haven't really talked about yet, and it is the shadow economy in Venezuela. So like the shadow economy emerged due to the hyperinflation, the sanctions, and the government mismanagement. And the shadow economy in Venezuela is basically the black market where there's many unregulated street vendors, informal labor market, informal black market currency trading and smuggling, basically. And according to the estimates, economists estimate that informal black market shadow economy account for over 60% of Venezuela's GDP as of the last decade. And this basically shows that people don't trust the government, which is why there's a huge shadow economy. And why would they trust the government? Because there's hyperinflation and the currency collapsed. And because of this, the black market has sort of become the de facto standard for Venezuela, as the official rate that the government sets is basically irrelevant, and the black market rate is the one that people actually use. So I would say, yeah, the shadow economy is probably the survival mechanisms for many Venezuelans now, because the government is ineffective, and because of this, many Venezuelans use the black market. So, given this information, like I would like to ask, like Shazib, Abdullah, or Araf, like how do you think Venezuela could have mitigated this economic collapse? Like how do you think like it could have diversified, if that makes sense, like from the oil revenues that Venezuela had?
So I must say I do agree with Arab, but the thing is, Venezuela was in a time of crisis, and it should have really like thought about how it could stabilize its currency more. So it could have attached its currency to the US dollar, and it could have attached it to oil and gold. Like I just like you said, people were actually, they didn't really trust their currency that much, so they went to the black market instead. But the thing is, if people actually trusted them, and the currency was actually attached to a reliable source of income, as we mentioned earlier, like the Middle Eastern countries, they would relate it to the USA dollar, gold, and oil, which are the most reliable resources to our day, and they will stay for many centuries to come. So if Venezuela could have just, focused on spreading their economy and attaching it to many districts instead of focusing on districts that are in the country and expanding it to the USA and other countries which have a stronger GDP, it would have slightly helped them, or exclusively helped them.
Yeah, Arif, I think you asked a really good question. And I also agree with what you said, Abdullah. And I think to just add my opinion into it, I'd say that they could invest in diversification. For example, Venezuela could have invested more in agriculture, a sector that was neglected despite the country's rich natural resources and fertile land. And by modernizing agriculture and investing in infrastructure, Venezuela could have reduced its dependence on food imports and even become a net exporter of agricultural products. And another potential area for diversification was manufacturing. With its oil revenues, Venezuela could have developed a robust manufacturing sector, producing goods for both domestic consumptions and export. And this would not only have provided jobs, but it would have also helped to reduce the country's reliance on imports. And also, tourism is another sector that Venezuela could have capitalized on. With its beautiful landscapes, diverse ecosystems, and cultural heritage, the country had the potential to develop a thriving tourism industry. Proper investment in infrastructure, safety, and marketing could have attracted international visitors, creating an alternative resource for revenue.
Yeah, I believe that Arif's question has been nicely answered by Abdullah and Shazib. Now let's talking a little bit about the comparison between the Middle East, which is obviously a very the Middle East, no, not Middle East, but the Gulf, specifically the Gulf. So talking about the Gulf count, like the Gulf area, which is also encompassed by the Gulf Cooperation Council (GCC), and GCC is basically, you can call it the EU of the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, and it includes countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Abdullah's country, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman, and all of these countries are heavily dependent on oil. And obviously, Venezuela is obviously also dependent on oil, and actually, Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, and still Venezuela is suffering, its people are suffering, while in the GCC it's their people are not. And I think it's also very important to look at the different differences that they have, not just politics but also economic. For example, that some of you have already highlighted, the economic mismanagement and the diversification. The Venezuelan economy is heavily dependent on oil revenue with limited diversification, and this resilience, my bad, this really reliance creates vulnerability to oil price fluctuations and economic instability, and poor management and corruption have further exacerbated these issues. While the GCC, which is again composed of countries Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman, these countries have also relied heavily on oil, but they have diversified their economies to a greater extent. For instance, Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in sectors like tourism, finance, and technology through its Vision 2030, while the UAE has developed tourism, real estate, and trade. And another very important thing that is often overlooked is political stability and governance. In Venezuela, political instability, corruption, and authoritarian practices have hampered effective governance and economic development. The concentration of power and lack of institutional checks have led to economic mismanagement and reduced consumer confidence. While in the GCC, these countries have maintained relatively stable political environments through their monarchy style rule, which have facilitated consistent economic policies and investments. While they also have faced challenges, their political stability has contributed to better economic outcomes. And there are also the social policies and the public mismanagement. For example, talking about Venezuela, although there have been attempts to use oil wealth for social programs, economic mismanagement and corruption have undermined all of these efforts that have been undertaken by the Venezuelan government, and the country has also struggled to to translate all revenue into long-term living standards and long-term improvement in living standards for its people. And then also, when compared to the GCC, these countries have used all revenue to invest heavily in infrastructure, healthcare, education, contributing to higher standards and economic reliance. Especially if you talk about the GCC countries, for example, I've been to the UAE a lot. The UAE has one of the best roads I've ever seen in the world, and this highlights that the infrastructure, the government used the infrastructure to improve the conditions of the people and to make sure that the people are not just dying, they are also flourishing. And then you also have the international relations and sanctions. Economic sanctions and international isolation, particularly from the US and EU, have further strengthened Venezuela's economy. And these sanctions have targeted key sectors and individuals, worsening the economic crisis. While if you look at GCC, these countries have maintained strategic alliance and favored international relations with the US, which have supported the economic stability and growth. If you look at all of the GCC countries, they have relatively very, very good relations with the US, even though you don't expect, even though it's not talked about a lot. But I think compared to nations such as, for example, if you compare to the South Asian nations, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we don't have that of much of a good relations with the US, just like the GCC does, mostly because of nationalist reasons. So it highlights that it's very important to have international relations. And the final point is corruption and governance, which I've talked about a little bit. If you look at the corruption of the Venezuela, it's very high. While looking at GCC, is there corruption? Yes, that's true. There is corruption everywhere, but the corruption rate is relatively low when compared to Venezuela. For example, talking about a little bit about corruption, I can give you a real world example. I'm from Bangladesh. We three are from Bangladesh, and Abdullah is from Kuwait. There was a Bangladeshi member of parliament. His name was Mohammed Shahidul Islam. He was also known as Qazi Papul, and he was arrested in Kuwait. He was actually arrested from the Mishraf residential area because he bribed a Kuwaiti minister, and the Kuwaiti minister was actually a member of the royal family. And both of them were arrested, and both of them were sentenced to 7 years in prison for human trafficking, for bribery, and all of these things. So this highlights that high-ranking officials such as ministers in like countries like Kuwait cannot get away with corruption, which highlights a good governance and a good system to fight corruption, and which Venezuela obviously doesn't have, which is one of the reasons why the economy of Venezuela is the way it is right now. So, are there any opinions or any information that Shazib Karim, Abdullah Baqer, or Arif Malik that you would like to add to the things that I've just said?
So I do agree with you regarding the topic of the non-corruption here. But the thing is with Venezuela is that, as you said, they have one of the biggest oil reserves in the world, one that should be toppling Kuwait. But the thing is, if they use their oil and resources in a good way, instead of using it on corruption, I am sure that their economy would look much different today, and their people would be thriving, not suffering.
Shazib, you have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure, Araf, I'll add some more information, and I can talk about the role of corruption as you were talking about. So I'd say like corruption has been pervasive. It has pervasive issues within Venezuela, contributing to the economic collapse, as the use of state resources to buy political loyalty and the embezzlement of public funds and the lack of transparency in government dealings have severely weakened the country's institutions. And PDFSA, the state oil company, became a symbol of this corruption under both Chavez and Maduro. The company was used to fund government projects and social programs, but it was also a source of wealth for those connected to the regime. Billions of dollars in oil revenue were siphoned off to corrupt deals and mismanagement, leaving the country and, by extension, the country crippled.
Arif, you have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would also like to add the fact that the corruption in Venezuela was not just in the in the government sector, but also in the private sector as well. Like many of the private basically the problem was that Maduro employed crony capitalism, which means that only his loyal allies, friends, and whatever business partners, like they benefited from Venezuelan economy, which is very bad because crony capitalism doesn't allow the general public to do businesses in the country, which means that only people related to the president could do business. And since the president was in power for over 15 years, it basically meant that only the friends and families of one man can only do business in a country, which is very bad. And as a result of this, it is no wonder that many of the Venezuelans actually left the country, and many of them actually go to Colombia and other South American countries where there's less corruption. And like corruption in Venezuela was not only in that sector, but I would also say like in the judiciary and law enforcement sector. Basically, like judges were bribed to do favorable rulings, and law enforcement officers like the police, army, they were frequently involved in like extortion and drug trafficking. So because of this, Venezuela consistently ranks even today as a country as like one of the low as in the justice according to the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. I believe Venezuela still ranks as one of the bottom countries in terms of adherence to the rule of law, and this reflects the extent to which corruption has undermined the judicial system, the private system, and the public system as well. And not only that, I would say the kickbacks of the corruption is also because it doesn't promote meritocracy. Like in Bangladesh, for example, like there was a protest like a 1 month ago or like 3 weeks ago, in which like people wanted more jobs based on meritocracy instead of the quotas. And in Venezuela, for example, there's no quotas and there is no meritocracy. It's basically just bribes. And in 2018, U.S. investigation uncovered that over $1.2 billion of money laundering scheme were involved with Venezuelan officials who siphoned off money that they had received from oil revenue and from people who wanted to do jobs. to other nations, and these illicit money laundering showed that contributed to the depletion of the Venezuelan foreign currency reserve, which fell from $30 billion in 2011 to $5 billion in 2021. So the question arises: where did the $25 billion go? And the truth is, basically, Maduro and his cronies siphoned it off to maybe Panama or some other nation where they can keep their money without really disclosing their names and other details. So yeah, basically the corruption in Venezuela is so bad that even the foreign currency reserve has basically been drowned to nothing, and it basically shows that the government officials are not patriotic. They just want money, and the problem is, even if they're corrupt, if they at least keep the money in the country and invest in domestic assets, at least the country will improve. But the problem with Venezuelan officials is that they use the money and they siphon it off to another country, which means the Venezuelan currency suffers, and also the foreign currency reserve also suffer, and that is why I think the Venezuelan officials, the act that they do are very unpatriotic and very not very smart as well.
Yeah, Arif, I think you brought up a really interesting point. Like, you were talking about some really interesting points, and I think to add my own opinion and add some more information, I'd say that the internal relations within Venezuela offer a stark reminder of how political polarization, authoritarianism, corruption, and social unrest can contribute to economic collapse. For Venezuela, the path to recovery will require addressing these deep-seated issues. This means rebuilding democratic institutions, restoring the rule of law, and creating an inclusive political environment where all voices are heard. And Arif, you had mentioned about how in our own country, in Bangladesh, there were a lot of protests going on about the quota system and the quota movement protests, and you talked about how there is no quota in Venezuela. But I'd say also in just how our country also has to deal with corruption, and how our country also wants to rebuild democratic institutions, and how our country also wants to restore the rule of law. I think Venezuela also has to do it in the same way, and it also means tackling corruption head on and ensuring that public resources are used for the benefit of all citizens, not just a select few. And finally, addressing the humanitarian crisis and rebuilding trust between the government and the people will be crucial for any long-term recovery.
Thank you for all the opinions that have been shared. Now let's get into a conclusion about the Venezuelan crisis, economic crisis, and whether it is a failure of socialism or is a result of US sanctions. So basically, some may argue it's a failure of socialism, economic mismanagement, centralized control. The Venezuelan government's heavy-handed approach to economic control led to inefficiencies, and the nationalization, including of key sectors such as oil and agriculture, were nationalized without effective management, leading to reduced productivity. And there was also high levels of corruption within state-owned enterprises, which diminished the benefits of oil revenue. And then the dependence on oil revenue, for example, Venezuela's economy became overly dependent on oil exports, which accounted for over 90% of export revenue, and the reliance on oil made the economy highly vulnerable to global oil fluctuations. When prices fell, the economy suffered dramatically, and as for the lack of diversification, in sufficient investment in other sectors led to a lack of economic diversification, exacerbating the impact of falling oil prices. And the hyperinflation and the currency devaluation due to socialist policies led to a hyperinflation, which obviously made the money worthless, and the strict currency controls led to a black market for foreign exchange, which created a disparity between official and market exchange rates. And the social program and inefficiencies. While the social programs aim to reduce poverty, mismanagement, and corruption diminished their effectiveness, and giving free money to away to people meant that people were not incentivized to work. And the public sector expansion increased spending on social programs and public sector expansion led to fiscal deficits and borrowing. As for the impacts of U.S. sanctions, the targeted U.S. sanctions, which were targeted towards Venezuelan officials, state-owned enterprises, and the oil sector, and the key measures included asset freezes, travel bans, and restrictions on financial transactions with the Venezuelan government and the PDVSA, which was a state oil company. And some may argue that export restrictions on Venezuela restricted Venezuela's ability to sell oil in international markets, significantly reducing revenue, and these sanctions limited Venezuela's access to international financial systems, making it difficult to obtain loans or engage in financial trade. And the economic crisis in Venezuela is obviously a multifaceted issue with contributions from both domestic and international actions. The failure of socialist policies, including economic mismanagement, dependence on oil, and corruption, created a fragile economic environment that was highly susceptible, unsustainable to external shocks. And moreover, the government, which the Venezuelan government, which obviously has committed a lot of crimes against its own people, and obviously the Venezuelan government doesn't want to work with anyone, doesn't want to work with the US, and the Venezuelan government chose to be isolated. And for this reason, I feel that the Venezuelan economic crisis is a result of failure of socialism and poor governments instead of the result of US sanctions, because the US sanctions were placed because of the Venezuelan government's severe violation of human rights and for killing people for electoral fraud and for other such reasons. So I think it's more as a result of socialism. So I would like to hear your opinions about this issue. Shazib Karim, Abdullah Baqer, or Arif Malik.
Okay, so regarding the topic where you said Venezuela isn't interested in making any alliances, and this is the specific part where Venezuela lacks in. It should be investing in relationships and domestic, how can we say it, laws around the world. Instead, it decides to keep its hands to itself and not do any trade with these superpower countries, which could actually benefit them in many ways. So they are doing this to themselves, and they are deciding to keep it this way because they don't feel comfortable making alliances with these countries. So either they move on and keep their paths and go on and do a better future, or they could keep the way they are. And yeah.
Shazib, you have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. So, to add on to what you were talking about, Araf, about the economic crisis, I'd say that one of the most dramatic aspects of Venezuela's economic crisis has been hyperinflation. By 2017, inflation had reached over 1,000%, and it continued to escalate, eventually surpassing 1 million percent in 2018. And the Venezuelan Bolivia, once a relatively stable currency, became practically worthless. Hyperinflation eroded the purchasing power of Venezuelans, making it impossible for most people to afford basic necessities, and the government attempted to control prices through price controls and subsidies. But these measures are only led to further distortions in the market, widespread shortages, and the emergence of a black market where goods were sold off exorbitant prices. And to combat hyperinflation, the government introduced a new currency, the sovereign Bolivia, in 2018, slashing 5 zeros off the old currency. However, this move did little to stem the tide of inflation, and the new currency quickly suffered the same fate as its predecessor. And also, to talk about the humanitarian crisis, I'd say that the economic crisis in Venezuela has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the Western Hemisphere, with hyperinflation wiping out savings and incomes. Millions of Venezuelans have fallen into extreme poverty, and the collapse of public services, including healthcare, education, and transportation, has further exacerbated the situation. Food shortages have been widespread, with the average Venezuelan losing significant weight due to malnutrition, and medicine and medical supplies are scarce, leading to the resurgence of diseases that were once under control, such as malaria and measles. And the humanitarian crisis has forced over 7 million Venezuelans to flee the country.
Arif, you have your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah. So I would also like to talk about the fact that socialism. We haven't really talked that much about the socialism in Venezuela, but like one of the eight factors of the average of the that determines the average labor productivity, which then determines the GDP output, is culture and the institutions, and under institution government falls. So I would say the one of the reasons why the Venezuelan GDP is not like really growing at a sustainable rate compared to other South American countries is because of the culture. And I would say, like, not necessarily, I don't want to deem the Venezuelans as not hardworking people, but the truth is that South American countries, the average work week in South American countries is actually less compared to like countries such as Bangladesh or like other South Asian countries, which means that the people are working less in these countries. And it's their culture. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, but I would say it's also one of the reasons why the GDP isn't growing that much, because not only are they working less, but also they are not productive enough. And even if they're working less, if they're productive, then it makes up for it. But the problem in Venezuela is that the people work less, and also they're not productive enough in the sense that, and in that sense, the GDP is not growing that much. And I would say like the socialism in Venezuela is also a big problem, because people don't tend to work that much, because they rely on the government. Because they culturally, like in the 80s and 90s, when Venezuela you actually used to be rich, people relied on free education, free healthcare, and basically like everything was subsidized by the government. So people didn't really have to work that much. But now that the government has shifted, the economy has shifted, people actually have to work more to offset these economic challenges. But since culturally they have been brought up in a way that government will help them, and they won't, and usually they also don't work that much. This has led to disastrous economic performance from the Venezuelan perspective. But I would also say that the fact that people are leaving Venezuela. So when there's migration out of the country, it's actually disastrous for the economy, because as Sajid mentioned, that I believe that over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2015, and this is one of the largest migration crises in the world. So basically, the point is that if all the people of your country are leaving, then who's gonna work in your country, and then how is your country gonna develop? Because you need people to work in order for the country to develop. And because of this, I would say Venezuela is suffering because people are leaving the country. And I do empathize with the people, because they don't really have a choice, because it's much better to settle abroad than to stay in Venezuela. But I would say for Venezuela to turn a new page and to be successful economically once again, like Brazil, for example, the Brazilian real also changed a couple of times because of hyperinflation, but eventually it settled because they tried to peg it to the US dollar. So I would say it would be better if Venezuela tries to settle its beef, I would say, with the US, and actually try to befriend them, because the US has strong regional hegemony in the South America and in Central America, Latin America, all those places, especially as it's near the US. So if Venezuela became an ally of the US, it would be economically good for them. And if they peg their currency to the dollar, like I believe also Argentina uses the US dollar now, but I'm not saying to use the US dollar, but for some short time, if Venezuela used the US dollar as their official currency, and then maybe they can create their own currency, it would be the smartest solution at the moment.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing your invaluable opinions. So the conclusion that I can draw based on our discussion is that the economic crisis in Venezuela is obviously a multifaceted issue with contributions from both domestic policies and international actions. And the failure of socialist policies, including economic mismanagement, dependence on oil, and corruption, created a economic environment that was highly unsustainable to environment external shockers. And the Venezuelan government repeated actions of making conflict with the US, and repeated actions of human rights violation, of killing people for no reason, and for election fraud, and for no reason, just for showing that they are powerful, for just creating chaos with the US. It's one of the reasons why Venezuela has been suffering from economic crisis, because the US obviously reacted with to the human rights violation, to the Venezuelans election fraud with sanctions, and for this reason I believe that Venezuela's economic crisis is a result of a failure of socialism and poor governance, and not because of the result of the US sanctions. So that's what I believe, that the failure of socialism and poor governance created the Venezuela's economic crisis. So is that an opinion that all of you agree with? Shazib Karim, Abdullah, Baqer, and Arif Malik?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your agreements. And now that brings us to the end of episode 18, Venezuela's economic crisis, a failure of socialism or the result of US sanctions, with Abdullah Baqer. I would like to again thank Abdullah for coming into to this episode and for sharing his invaluable opinions. Are there any final words, Abdullah, that you would like to say before we leave for today?
Yes, I would like to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be able to learn more about Venezuela's economy and to be able to just share your opinion. And yeah, thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Abdullah, for coming into this episode. Again, today was episode 18, Venezuela's economic crisis, a failure of socialism or the result of US sanctions, with Abdullah Baqer. Thank you to the audience for listening to this episode. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And we hope to see you next week with another very important topic and with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you and goodbye for now.